The sun rose that morning like an unyielding eye over the town of Willow Creek, casting long, harsh shadows across the dusty main street. Its rays glinted off broken windows, scattered debris, and the chipped paint of old storefronts that had seen better decades. But no shadow was darker than the one looming over the Baker family that day. 5 daughters, each a portrait of resilience and quiet courage, stood lined up on the wooden planks outside the town hall, their clothes torn and patched, their eyes reflecting the same mix of fear, defiance, and disbelief. They were being judged, not for who they were, but for what their father owed, a gambling debt so vast it had devoured every possession, every ounce of dignity, until only the girls remained, standing as collateral for a man's mistakes. The first to be called forward was Emily, the eldest, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of her worn apron. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a spark of empathy that didn't exist. The men in the front row, their boots scuffed and faces weathered, barked numbers like they were choosing cattle. One of them, Barker, a man known for his temper and cruelty, smirked as he waved a coin, his gaze resting on Emily as though she were no more than a commodity. The youngest among the daughters, Lily, barely 16, tried to shrink into herself, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. But her spirit, fierce and untamed, refused to bow. She met the gaze of a bystander across the street, a quiet stranger with dark eyes and an aura of calm, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope. Hours passed like an eternity. Each sister was taken in turn, claimed by strangers whose intentions were as clear as the sweat streaking their faces. Mary, gentle and kind, was dragged away by a merchant who saw her as property, not a person. Clara and Jane, twins whose laughter had once filled the small Baker home, were sold to men whose smiles didn't reach their eyes, whose hands were rough and possessive. With each sister led away, Lily's chest tightened, a heavy knot of fear and despair threatening to crush the fragile hope that still lingered inside her. She tried to focus on the distant hills, the promise of open land where the wind might carry her sorrow away, but reality was merciless. Then came the final moment. The auctioneer's gavel raised, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a whip. And now the last of the Baker daughters, Lily, 16, healthy, hardworking, capable of tending home and hearth with unmatched skill. His words hung in the air, but Lily heard only the silence that followed, the weight of all eyes pressing down on her young shoulders. She clenched her fists, remembering the nights she had spent secretly mending her sister's clothes, preparing meals with nothing but scraps, and keeping her father's anger from spilling onto the girls. She had always believed that her efforts mattered, that someone somewhere would see the worth in her, but that belief had been tested, stretched thin, and nearly broken. And then, like a sudden gust of wind that clears a stormy sky, a man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Daniel Hartwell. No one noticed him at first. He was just a stranger, his clothes simple but neat, his posture calm, almost regal in its quiet authority. Yet the moment he spoke, his voice, low and steady, seemed to make the entire square pause. "I will take her," he said. Not as a purchase, not as a transaction, as a choice, as a declaration of something far greater than the numbers shouted by greedy men. A hush fell over the crowd. The auctioneer blinked, caught mid-motion, his gavel suspended like a faltering heartbeat. Did you say what I think you said?" he stammered, disbelief etched in every line of his face. Daniel nodded once, his gaze fixed on Lily, but not in a possessive way. In his eyes was a recognition, a quiet reverence for her courage, her resilience, her humanity. "I offer her something that cannot be measured in gold or coin," he continued. "Respect, dignity, the chance to live as she deserves, not as property." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She had expected pity, maybe a cruel joke, but not this. This assertion of her worth that made her feel seen for the first time in months. The men in the crowd shifted uneasily, the smug smirks replaced by uncertain frowns. Some whispered, others stared in stunned silence, realizing that the rules they had relied on, their entitlement, their unquestioned dominance, had been challenged in an instant. Daniel stepped closer, and Lily saw it clearly now. He was a man who had faced loss, who understood pain, but who had chosen justice over cruelty. "I will not buy her as one buys cattle," he said, "but as one honors a life. If she consents, she will walk from this square not as a prize, but as my equal, my partner, my friend." His words hung like a promise in the dusty air. Lily's eyes welled with tears, but not from despair, from hope, from recognition that someone at last understood that her worth was not measured by her father's failures, or by the greed of strangers. She nodded slowly, her voice a whisper but firm. "I will trust you." In that moment, the wind seemed to shift across Willow Creek. The townspeople, once complicit in cruelty, were forced to witness the power of respect and humanity over greed. The auctioneer, still pale, brought down his gavel, not to claim property, but to acknowledge a truth that could not be denied. Justice had arrived, in the form of a man who saw a young girl not as a commodity, but as a person of value. And as Lily stepped forward, hand in hand with Daniel Hartwell, the first stirrings of hope began to spread among the crowd, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, courage, kindness, and integrity would always find a way to prevail. The following weeks in Willow Creek were heavy with whispers. The story of Daniel Hartwell stepping forward to save Lily from the auction spread faster than wildfire through the narrow streets and sun-baked alleyways. Some shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about strangers meddling where they didn't belong, while others dared to imagine a world where dignity could triumph over greed. For Lily, the days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, gratitude, but also a lingering fear that this sudden turn of fortune was too good to be real. She had survived her father's reckless debts, the town's judgment, and the cruelty of strangers, but her spirit was scarred in ways that no words could fully heal. Daniel Hartwell's presence was a quiet anchor amidst the storm. Each morning he would visit the Baker home, offering guidance, support, and most importantly, respect. He did not rush her, did not impose authority or expect gratitude. He merely treated her as an equal, and slowly that simple act began to stitch together the pieces of confidence that life had torn apart. Lily found herself noticing the little things, the way he listened without interruption, the care with which he tended his small but well-kept garden, the subtle kindness he showed to neighbors who had been too proud or too wary to ask for help. There was no grand display of wealth, no ostentation, yet his presence alone seemed to radiate the promise of safety, of justice, of something far more enduring than mere survival. But not everyone in Willow Creek was ready to accept change. Barker, the same man who had bid cruelly for Lily the day of the auction, had been simmering with resentment since that fateful afternoon. His pride had been wounded, his authority challenged in front of the entire town, and he refused to forgive or forget. Each morning he prowled near the Baker home, muttering threats under his breath, glaring at Lily as if she were the source of his humiliation. "Lucky girl," he sneered one afternoon as she walked past the market, "saved by some fancy stranger who probably doesn't belong here." But Lily, remembering Daniel's calm strength and the dignity he had restored to her life, refused to react. She walked tall, her eyes forward, her heart quiet but determined. It wasn't long before a new test came, one that threatened not just Lily's sense of safety, but her very future. The town council, emboldened by Barker's whispers, announced an inspection of the Baker property. Their intention was clear: to find fault, to humiliate, to strip away any sense of progress Lily and her family had gained. The council arrived on a sweltering afternoon, clipboards in hand, expressions sharp and judgmental. They scrutinized the worn fences, the patchwork roof, the modest garden, their eyes darting as though expecting the house itself to confess to wrongdoing. Daniel stepped forward first, blocking the council's path with a calm authority that silenced the murmurs and hushed the whispers. "This home," he said, his voice steady, "may not be grand by the standards of some, but it is cared for with integrity, effort, and pride. The daughters of this house have done more to uphold dignity than many in this town have ever known." The council, taken aback, scribbled on their papers nervously. Barker stepped forward, his face red with fury. "Do you think your words mean anything, stranger? This is a town of rules, and rules must be followed." Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed Lily to step forward beside him. Her voice, though soft at first, carried a clarity and confidence that startled everyone present. "We have worked for every scrap of dignity we have. My family has survived because we never gave up, because we never stopped believing in fairness. I will not be shamed or belittled for circumstances beyond my control." Her eyes met Barker's, unflinching, and for the first time, the man who had once felt untouchable hesitated. The council members exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Daniel, sensing the shift, added, "And I will personally vouch for the integrity of this home and the character of these daughters. Anyone attempting to undermine them is attempting to defy justice itself. Consider this a warning and a promise. Cruelty will not be tolerated here." The tension in the square was palpable. The air itself seemed to vibrate with expectation. Barker's fist clenched at his sides. He realized that his power had evaporated in the presence of honesty and courage. For the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his arrogance. One by one, the council members nodded reluctantly. Stepping back from the Baker home, their inspection abandoned not out of fear, but because the truth had been made undeniably clear. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, and the sky ignited in brilliant streaks of orange and pink, Lily and her sisters sat together in the small kitchen, a quiet calm settling over them. Daniel was there too, seated in the corner, offering tea and quiet conversation. The daughters exchanged glances, relief mingled with newfound confidence. They had been tested, underestimated, and threatened. But each obstacle had been met with courage, resilience, and the steadfast support of someone who refused to see them as less than they were. In that moment, Lily realized something profound. The world might always challenge her, might always try to impose limits or expectations, but she possessed something no one could take away: her dignity, her courage, and her willingness to stand for herself. And for the first time, she felt the weight of possibility resting on her shoulders, not as a burden but as a promise. The night grew quiet, but the lesson lingered in the cool air of Willow Creek. Power lies not only in wealth or status, but in the courage to claim respect and stand against cruelty. And as Daniel quietly left the Baker home that night, he looked back once, seeing the daughters standing strong in the doorway, and knew that this was only the beginning. The quiet of Willow Creek was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities that lingered like shadows at the edges of every street. Lily and her sisters had survived the auction, endured the judgmental eyes of the town, and with Daniel Hartwell's guidance, reclaimed a measure of dignity. But true justice, they would soon learn, was not simply about survival. It was about confronting those who sought to undermine them, exposing cruelty where it hid, and standing unshakable in the face of fear. It began on a morning when the air was crisp and the first frost had crept across the rooftops, glinting like scattered diamonds in the weak sunlight. Lily and her sisters were tending their small garden, pulling weeds and preparing for the season's harvest, when a commotion erupted near the market square. A wealthy merchant from a neighboring town, known for his arrogance and sharp tongue, had arrived with a caravan of wagons and men, claiming that the Bakers owed him money from debts their father had never settled. His words were laced with contempt, his eyes scanning the sisters as if they were nothing more than extensions of a man he despised. Emily, the eldest, stepped forward first, her hands trembling slightly but her posture firm. "We pay what is owed when it is fair and just," she said, her voice carrying across the crisp morning air. The merchant laughed, a cruel booming sound. "Fair? Justice? You are children, and this town knows it. Your father's debts are mine to collect, and you will provide for them or face consequences." His men moved closer, boots crunching on the frost-bitten earth, their presence an unmistakable threat. Lily felt a rush of panic, but it was tempered by the memory of Daniel's unwavering presence during the auction and the council's inspection. She straightened her back and met the merchant's gaze. "We have never sought to hide from responsibility," she said, her voice firm. "But we will not be threatened, humiliated, or bullied. Our family is capable of defending our honor, and those who believe otherwise will learn a lesson in respect." The merchant's laugh turned sharp, almost vicious. "You, children? What can you possibly do?" That's when Daniel Hartwell appeared, seemingly from nowhere, his steps deliberate and measured. The merchant's men tensed immediately, recognizing the stranger from the tales that had already begun to circulate through Willow Creek. "Children?" Daniel's voice carried over the crowd, calm but filled with authority. "These are daughters of resilience. They have survived cruelty and injustice that many men could not endure, and I assure you, sir, they are far more capable than you can imagine." The merchant's smirk faltered slightly, curiosity flickering behind his arrogant gaze. Daniel continued, his tone unwavering. "I will not allow threats to harm those who have done nothing but live with dignity. If you proceed with your intimidation, You will face consequences far beyond your understanding." The tension in the square became almost unbearable. The merchant, emboldened by his numbers, raised his hand as if to signal an attack. But before he could, Daniel reached into his coat and produced a letter sealed with a distinctive crest. The sight of it caused a hush to ripple through the gathered townspeople. "This letter," Daniel said, holding it aloft, "is from the mayor of Oak Ridge, confirming my position as a major stakeholder in the Hartwell Trading Company, which holds considerable influence throughout this region. Any attempt to undermine these daughters or their family will be met with legal action and the full force of my resources. Consider this your only warning." The merchant's confident facade cracked, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He had underestimated not only Daniel's power, but also the resolve of the daughters standing boldly beside him. He realized too late that they were not helpless children to be intimidated, but a family backed by a man whose influence and integrity demanded respect. Lily felt a surge of pride. For the first time, she saw clearly the tangible result of courage combined with guidance, support, and the refusal to bow to injustice. Her sisters, once timid and unsure, stood with her, their heads held high, their eyes gleaming with determination. The merchant, flustered and unwilling to provoke legal retaliation, backed down with a muttered curse, retreating to his wagons with his men trailing silently behind. As the dust settled, the townspeople began to murmur, admiration replacing doubt. Some had always doubted the girl's abilities. Others had openly mocked their circumstances. But now they could not deny the lesson unfolding before them. Underestimation breeds humiliation, while courage and resilience command respect. That evening, the Baker household was alive with quiet celebration. The daughters shared laughter that had been long absent, telling stories of small victories, of moments where fear had been transformed into courage. Daniel, sitting in the corner, watched with quiet satisfaction, his eyes reflecting both pride and humility. He had intervened not for glory, but to teach the town and the daughters themselves that true strength lies in moral courage, integrity, and the refusal to bow to cruelty. As the night deepened and the stars began to pierce the velvet sky, Lily sat near the window watching the world outside. She realized that life had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, yet each trial had shaped her. Each act of injustice had taught her the value of dignity, and each act of support and kindness had shown her the true meaning of justice. She felt a deep, unshakable resolve forming inside her, a promise that she would never again allow cruelty to go unchallenged. The cold wind of early winter swept through Willow Creek, carrying with it whispers of doubt, envy, and hidden intentions. Life had begun to settle into a fragile rhythm for Lily and her sisters. The Baker household, once a place of fear and despair, had become a sanctuary of hope, resilience, and quiet pride. Yet just as the frost can coat even the brightest flowers, danger lurked where least expected. The daughters had learned to recognize cruelty in strangers, but there were lessons yet to be learned about betrayal from those they thought they could trust. It began with a letter, delivered on a gray, overcast morning. The envelope was worn and unassuming, yet the handwriting made Lily's stomach twist with unease. It was from Martha, the Baker family's longtime neighbor, the woman who had watched the girls grow, helped care for them when their father spiraled into his vices, and shared in their small triumphs and tragedies. The letter seemed kind at first glance, filled with concern and urgency. But the words carried a hidden edge, a subtle manipulation that hinted at danger if the family did not comply with Martha's advice. She suggested that Daniel Hartwell's influence might not be enough to protect them, that the daughters were risking everything by standing boldly against the town, and that their only safety lay in retreating, in yielding control. Emily read the letter aloud, her voice wavering as the words sank into the room. She's saying, "We shouldn't rely on Daniel, that we're in danger if we continue to stand up for ourselves." Clara and Jane exchanged uneasy glances, and even Lily, whose spirit had been tempered by so many trials, felt a flicker of doubt creep into her mind. Could it be that someone they trusted, someone who had watched over them for years, could betray them so subtly, so insidiously? Before they could dwell too long, a knock came at the door. It was Barker, the same man who had once tried to intimidate them, his expression colder and more menacing than before. "Seems your little protector isn't around," he sneered, glancing at Daniel's empty garden. "Maybe it's time you learned what happens when you refuse to stay in your place." He stepped closer, his eyes darting with predatory intent, confident that the daughters, left alone, would crumble under fear. But Daniel had anticipated more than they knew. He had left that morning on a business matter, as he told them, but his departure had been calculated. The daughters, following the careful lessons he had instilled, did not panic. Instead, Lily took a deep breath and faced Barker squarely, her eyes blazing with a courage that had been forged in months of trials. "You underestimate us," she said firmly, her voice ringing across the cold, empty street. "We are not powerless, and your threats will not control us." Barker laughed, but it was a hollow, uncertain sound. He took another step forward, and then, from the shadows behind the girls, the ground seemed to tremble. Not literally, but in the sense of authority and presence. Daniel Hartwell emerged, not alone, but with several men he had quietly brought to the town as allies. Local lawmen, merchants, and even former rivals, who respected his integrity and power. Barker's confidence faltered. He had believed the daughters were alone, vulnerable and fearful, but Daniel's arrival transformed the scene. "You thought we were naive," Daniel said, his voice calm but commanding. "That these daughters could be intimidated. But you were wrong. Every act of cruelty has consequences. Every attempt to oppress will be met with justice. And you, sir, are about to see the truth of that lesson." Barker's face turned red with fury, and for a moment it seemed as if he might strike. But the men surrounding him moved swiftly, ensuring that no violence could erupt. The power dynamic had shifted instantly. The predator was cornered, exposed, and utterly powerless against the combined force of moral authority and strategic planning. The daughters stood tall, their heads held high, witnessing the downfall of the man who had sought to humiliate them. Emily's eyes glistened with tears, not of fear but of vindication. Lily felt a profound sense of relief and empowerment, realizing that the trials they had endured had not broken them. They had refined them, tempered their courage, and made their strength undeniable. Even Martha, watching from a distance, had no choice but to acknowledge the daughter's resilience and Daniel's unwavering commitment. Later, as the town began to buzz with news of Barker's humiliation and retreat, Lily and her sisters gathered in their home, the warmth of the fire reflecting their renewed sense of security and hope. They had faced betrayal, threats, and the subtle manipulation of someone they once trusted, and yet through it all, they had endured. Through courage, vigilance, and the guidance of a man who valued justice over greed, the daughters had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. And as night fell over Willow Creek, Lily whispered to her sisters, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "No matter what comes next, we will stand tall. We will not be defined by fear or cruelty, and we will always remember that dignity and courage are stronger than anyone's threats." Winter had tightened its grip on Willow Creek, painting the town in frost and muted grays. The Baker household, once teetering on the brink of despair, now stood as a symbol of resilience and quiet triumph. The daughters had faced public humiliation, intimidation, and even betrayal, but nothing could have fully prepared them for the challenge that was about to arrive. This was not a test of courage alone. It was a reckoning that would demand wisdom, unity, and a faith in justice so unwavering that it could not be shaken. It started with rumors, strange, insistent whispers drifting through the frozen streets. A wealthy landowner from the neighboring county, known for ruthlessness and a reputation for crushing anyone who dared oppose him, had taken an interest in the Baker property. His emissaries arrived quietly at first, masked with civility but laced with threats. They claimed that the Baker's land was technically under his jurisdiction, that debts and legal entanglements required immediate surrender, and that resistance would be costly in ways you cannot imagine. Lily felt a familiar rush of fear as she looked at her sisters. Memories of auctions, public humiliation, and threats surged forward, reminding her that the world could still be cruel and unforgiving. Yet beneath that fear, a spark of determination flared. The lessons Daniel Hartwell had instilled, about dignity, preparation, and refusing to be defined by others' cruelty, rose to the surface. The daughters would not bend, and this time they had a plan. When the emissaries arrived at the Baker home, Daniel Hartwell was waiting. His presence alone transformed the scene. He was no longer just a protector standing in the shadows. He had become a visible symbol of authority, power, and unwavering moral certainty. "I suggest you leave now," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of both personal conviction and strategic influence. You will find no compliance here, only the consequences of injustice if you persist. The emissaries, confident in the landowner's reputation, laughed politely. This is a small town, one said, and you are but strangers meddling in affairs that do not concern you. But Daniel smiled faintly, a quiet, knowing expression. Strangers? He replied. Perhaps, but my influence extends far beyond this town, and anyone who underestimates these daughters will quickly learn that courage and justice are not so easily defeated. Tension crackled in the frozen air. Lily and her sisters, standing together, radiated a combined strength that seemed to expand with every passing moment. They had learned to rely on one another, to draw power from shared experience and to face threats with both dignity and resolve. The emissaries, sensing the shift, hesitated. Their arrogance had blinded them to the unassailable truth. The daughters were no longer vulnerable. They were formidable. Daniel stepped forward and presented a set of documents, sealed with the crest of his influential trading company and legal authority that spanned the region. These papers, he said, confirm ownership rights, the legality of this property, and the enforceable protection of these daughters' livelihoods. Any attempt to oppose this is not just an affront to justice, it is a direct challenge to the law, one which will be met swiftly and decisively. For the first time, the emissaries' confidence faltered. They had assumed that wealth, intimidation, and fear would suffice to coerce the daughters. But Daniel's quiet authority, backed by documentation, legal power, and the visible courage of Lily and her sisters, shattered that assumption. Barker's earlier arrogance had been a rehearsal for this moment, an earlier lesson in underestimating the seemingly powerless. But here, the true consequence of such misjudgment became undeniable. The confrontation escalated for only a few minutes, yet to those watching it felt like hours. Every word, every pause, every glance carried weight, and then, the turning point came. The leader of the emissaries, realizing that persistence would result in public and legal humiliation, finally stepped back. His face was pale, his bravado evaporated under the combined force of morality, law, and courage. We will reconsider, he muttered, signaling the retreat of his men. As the last wagon disappeared down the frost-covered road, Lily exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of relief and vindication wash over her. The daughters had faced their greatest test yet, a threat that was legal, financial, and intimidating, but they had survived, not by submission but through unity, courage, and the unwavering support of Daniel Hartwell. That evening, the Baker household was filled with warmth, laughter, and quiet celebration. The daughters sat together around the fire, each of them reflecting on the journey they had traveled. They had endured auctions, intimidation, betrayal, and threats of ruin, but each trial had only strengthened their bond and honed their courage. Daniel watched from the corner, his gaze soft yet proud, knowing that the ultimate lesson had been learned. Dignity, resilience, and the refusal to yield to injustice are far more powerful than fear or intimidation. And as the stars blinked against the cold winter sky, Lily whispered to her sisters, her voice steady and full of conviction. We are stronger than any threat. Our courage cannot be bought, our dignity cannot be stolen, and our justice will always find a way. Spring had arrived in Willow Creek, softening the frost-bitten streets and breathing life into the town once again. The Baker household, long a symbol of struggle and resilience, now radiated hope, warmth, and a quiet triumph that the entire community could see. The daughters, Lily, Emily, Clara, Jane, and Mary, had endured months of trials that had tested not only their courage, but their very sense of self. Auctions, threats, intimidation, and betrayal had come in waves, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and united. And now, as the sun bathed the town in golden light, the final chapter of their story was about to unfold, a chapter that would leave the wrongdoers stunned and the daughters fully vindicated. The morning began with a sense of unusual anticipation. Townspeople whispered behind curtains and along sidewalks, their eyes darting toward the Baker home, curious about the sudden arrival of well-dressed carriages, polished horses, and figures of authority that had never before appeared in Willow Creek. At the center of it all was Daniel Hartwell, standing with an air of calm command that immediately silenced any murmurs of doubt. He had planned every detail of this day, anticipating that those who had sought to humiliate, intimidate, or cheat the daughters would eventually attempt one final act of defiance. Sure enough, as Daniel and the daughters prepared for the day, Barker and the wealthy landowner from the neighboring county, both still smarting from earlier failures, approached. Their expressions a mix of anger, disbelief, and overconfidence. Barker, whose arrogance had been broken repeatedly, tried one last show of dominance. "You think you've won?" he spat, stepping forward. "This town isn't yours to command." Lily, standing tall at Daniel's side, met his gaze without fear. "No," she said firmly. "It never was. But this town, like all of us, demands respect. And respect is not given lightly, it is earned. And cruelty is always its own punishment." Daniel stepped forward, the presence of authority and quiet power radiating from him like a physical force. "The debts, the threats, the intimidation, you will answer for them today," he said. "And the daughters of this household will witness justice done, not by anger but by truth, fairness, and consequence." With a simple nod from Daniel, the town sheriff, accompanied by representatives from neighboring counties, moved to act. Barker's face paled as he realized that the tables had turned completely. The landowner, too, stiffened, recognizing that the power he had assumed he wielded was entirely dependent on intimidation and fear, tools that no longer held sway in the presence of justice and courage. Legal documents, property deeds, and evidence of past attempts to coerce the Bakers were laid out for the entire town to witness. Every threat, every act of cruelty, every attempt at intimidation was exposed publicly. The townspeople gasped as the full scale of Barker's arrogance and the landowner's manipulation became undeniable. For the first time, the men who had tried to dominate the daughters were powerless, humiliated, and completely at the mercy of the truth. And then came the moment of poetic justice. Barker and the landowner were ordered to compensate the Baker family for their attempts at extortion, intimidation, and public humiliation. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the men, once so certain of their dominance, were forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty. The daughters, standing together, radiated quiet triumph, their heads held high, their eyes filled with pride and satisfaction. Later, as the sun dipped low over Willow Creek and the warm spring air filled the streets, Lily and her sisters gathered in the garden, reflecting on the journey they had endured. They had faced auctions, betrayal, intimidation, and legal threats, and had emerged not only victorious but transformed. They understood now more than ever that courage, dignity, and unity were forces stronger than fear, greed, or cruelty. Daniel stood quietly with them, a reassuring presence, knowing that his role had not been to dominate or dictate, but to guide, protect, and empower. "You have proven something remarkable," he said softly. "Not just to the town but to yourselves. You have learned that even in the face of relentless adversity, integrity, resilience, and courage will always prevail." Lily looked at her sisters, then out at the town that had once doubted them. She smiled, a mixture of relief, pride, and hope shining in her eyes. "We have faced everything together," she whispered. "And no matter what comes next, we will stand tall, always." The sun set over Willow Creek, bathing the town in golden light, a symbol of renewal, justice, and hope. The daughters had been tested, underestimated, and challenged, but in the end, the cruelty of others had only strengthened their resolve. And for those who had sought to oppress them, the lesson was clear. Justice comes for those who mistreat others, and dignity always triumphs over cruelty.